Let's explore a case of wrongful conviction today. 28-year-old man from Ohio, along with his brother, left their hometown to seek work elsewhere. Unexpectedly, just 3 days after their arrival, a tragic event occurred. The man was accused of shooting a police officer. From the beginning, the local residents were adamant that he was the culprit. However, it took more than 10 years for the truth to come to light. This famous case took place in Texas. The story happened in the 1970s in Texas, a southern state in the United States. Protagonist of our story is Randall Dale Adams, born in 1948. After graduating from high school, he served in the U.S. Airborne Forces for 3 years. Adams hailed from Grove City, Ohio. In October 1976, Adams and his brother left Ohio to seek opportunities in California. After arriving in California, they couldn't find suitable work, so they decided to try their luck in Texas. On November 25, 1976, which was a Thursday and also Thanksgiving Day, Adams and his brother drove to Dallas, Texas. Upon arrival, they found a roadside motel to settle in. After a good night's sleep, early on Friday morning, Adams began job hunting. At that time, finding a job in Dallas wasn't easy because many locals already had stable jobs. However, Adams was fortunate. He found a job at an abandoned airport in just half a day. He was informed that he would start work the next day. Little did he know that a tragedy was awaiting him. On Saturday, November 27, 1976, the 28-year-old man from Ohio left his apartment early in the morning. It was his first day at work. Upon arriving at the plant, Adams was told that work was not required every day of the week, and there was nothing to do that day. So, the boss told Adams to go home and return on Monday. Thus, Adams had to drive back home without accomplishing anything. Halfway home, his car suddenly broke down. He found out that the fuel tank was empty. With no other option, he grabbed an empty can from the trunk and walked to find the nearest gas station. Unfortunately, it was not only the weekend, but also Thanksgiving holiday, so many gas stations were closed. Adams continued searching alone on a deserted road. At this time, a blue car passed by. The driver, named David, was 16 years old. From a distance, David saw a man holding a can and stopped the car to ask if Adams needed help. Adams was overjoyed, finally finding someone willing to help. He got into David's car. David drove Adams around to find a gas station. Before long, they found a station, filled up the can, and refueled Adams' car. To express his gratitude, Adams invited David to his motel room to hang out. Adams drove his car ahead, leading the way, while David followed in his car. Soon, both cars arrived at the motel. Inside, Adams' brother was already there. They watched TV and chatted. Despite the 12-year age difference, Adams and David got along well. During the conversation, Adams learned that David, at 16, was not a local either. David's hometown was in Victoria, South Texas. The night before, he had driven all night to Dallas. The more they talked, the more they found common ground and decided to go to a club called Bronco Bow for some fun. The club offered food, bowling, and billiards. So, around 3 p.m., David drove his blue car, with Adams as a passenger, to the Bronco Bow Club. They ate, drank beer, and had a good afternoon there. In the evening, David suggested going to a drive-in movie theater. They set off in David's car. Adams noticed a handgun and a rifle. When Adams expressed curiosity, David took out the handgun and fired a few shots out the car window. Adams was shocked by this scene and tucked the handgun under the seat. Around 7 p.m., they bought hamburgers and 6 cans of beer, then headed to a drive-in theater. The drive-in theater was an open space where movies were shown outdoors. Viewers would drive in, sit in their cars, and enjoy the film. The two of them drank beer and watched the movie. After the film, they returned to the motel. Adams bought a pack of cigarettes and a newspaper at a convenience store, and they continued chatting. David asked if he could stay the night. Adams politely declined, saying his brother didn't like strangers staying over. However, Adams mentioned that David could come to his workplace on Monday, as they were looking for workers. He could talk to the boss and possibly get a job. After that, they said goodbye. Adams returned to his apartment. It was nearly 10 p.m. Adams found the TV in the living room still on, but his brother was asleep. Adams made himself a sandwich. At that time, the 10 news began. He watched for about 15 minutes, then turned off the TV and went to bed. Little did he know that just a few hours after he fell asleep, a shocking event would occur in Dallas. At 12:30 a.m., 2 Dallas Police Department officers were patrolling the streets. One of the officers was Wood, and the other was his female colleague, Teresa, one of the first female officers assigned to night patrols in the Dallas area. Knowing that the streets were quiet late at night, the 2 officers stopped their car by the roadside. They entered a fast food restaurant, bought a milkshake, and then returned to their car. Not long after, a blue car passed by without its headlights on, immediately catching the attention of the officers. They turned on their siren, followed the blue car, and signaled it to pull over. The blue car gradually came to a stop by the side of the road, with the police car stopping a few meters behind it. Officer Wood got out of the driver's seat and approached the blue car. Normally, when stopping a vehicle, Officer Wood would carry his ticket book, but this time he had left it in the car. It was clear that he had no intention of issuing a ticket. He simply wanted to remind the driver to turn on the headlights for safety. Officer Wood approached the driver's seat with a flashlight in hand. Before he could speak, a person inside unexpectedly pulled out a handgun and fired directly at Officer Wood. Bullet went through the flashlight and hit Wood's arm. The shooter then fired 4 to 5 more shots at Officer Wood. Caught off guard, Wood was hit in the arm, chest, and head, collapsing to the ground. After committing the crime, the assailant sped away, leaving Officer Teresa in shock. Hearing the gunshots, Officer Teresa quickly threw down her milkshake, opened the car door, drew her handgun, and fired several shots at the fleeing blue car. However, it was too late. The blue car had already escaped. Officer Teresa immediately reported the incident to the command center and requested backup. Backup officers arrived at the scene and confirmed that Officer Wood had died. They conducted a thorough investigation of the scene but found no valuable clues. The only witness was Officer Teresa. However, due to the suddenness of the event, she could only remember that the car involved was a blue Vega. She couldn't recall the license plate number. Killing a police officer is a serious crime that affects the dignity of the police force. Therefore, they had to find the perpetrator at all costs. The Dallas Police Department formed a special task force of 50 people to investigate the case. The investigators put in a lot of effort to track down all Vega cars in Dallas. Regardless of ownership, every car was meticulously checked, but they found nothing. Next, the Dallas police brought in a hypnosis expert from California to hypnotize Officer Teresa. The hypnosis was successful, and she remembered the license plate of the blue car. Police traced the license plate to its owner, a resident from Victoria, South Texas. The owner reported that on November 26th, his house had been broken into and several items were stolen, including his most valuable possession, a 1972 blue Comet. The man insisted that he knew the car thief, a troublesome 16-year-old neighbor named David. Following this lead, police speculated that the blue car from that night was the stolen Comet. Its appearance was similar to the Vega, which had caused Officer Teresa to mistake it for a Vega. In reality, it was a Comet. After that night, David drove the car from Dallas back to Victoria. The police arrested David in Victoria. He was suspected of being involved in the murder of Officer Wood. However, David told the police that the person who killed the officer was not him, but a man from Ohio named Adams. Thus, a month after the incident, Adams was arrested by the Dallas police. Based on David's testimony, Adams was charged with murder and taken to the police station. Adams felt he was wrongfully accused. He recounted the entire incident from that night in detail to the police, adding a few extra details. Adams stated that after they parted ways that evening, he returned to the motel apartment before 10 p.m. because he loved watching the Carol Burnett show, which started at 9 p.m. By the time he got back to the apartment, the show was nearly over. Then, when the 10 news began, he watched for a while before going to bed. 12:30 a.m., the time of the crime, he was asleep. He truly didn't understand why he was implicated in a shooting incident. The police did not believe a word of Adams' testimony because 16-year-old David told a completely different story. First, regarding the timeline, David stated that he met Adams around noon, while Adams said they met around 10 a.m. Next, David claimed they arrived at the Bronco Bow Club 5 p.m., while Adams said they got there at 3 p.m. David mentioned they finished watching the movie around midnight, whereas Adams said they finished before 10 p.m. Comparing their statements, it was clear that the times David provided were 2 to 3 hours later than Adam. Finally, the most critical time of the crime. David claimed that at 12:30 a.m., Adams was driving. They left the drive-in theater and were on their way back to the motel. Halfway there, a police car followed them and signaled them to pull over. Sitting in the passenger seat, David felt scared, and Adams told him to duck under the seat. After pulling over, the officer approached, and unexpectedly, Adams pulled out a handgun from under the seat and fired 5 to 6 shots at the officer. They then sped away towards the motel. Adams returned to the apartment, while David drove off. The testimonies of David and Adams were entirely contradictory, indicating that one of them was lying. David drove back to Victoria the following day. He boasted to his friends, waving a handgun and claiming that he had used it to kill a police officer. None of his friends believed him. They thought he was surely exaggerating. Shortly after returning to Victoria, David robbed a convenience store and threatened the cashier with a gun. The gun David used in the robbery was the same gun used to shoot and kill the police officer in Dallas. That time, David was on probation for juvenile-related offenses. He frequently committed robberies and thefts and was known as a troublesome boy. On the other hand, Adams had never committed a crime. Police couldn't even find a reasonable motive for him to kill the officer. The murder of Officer Wood caused great fear and anger among the local community. Someone had to be held accountable. Since David accused Adams of being the culprit, the Dallas County prosecutor decided to charge 28-year-old Adams. A year after the incident, trial began. The case prosecutor was Doug Mulder, top local prosecutor with an almost perfect winning record in court. During the trial, the prosecutor called several witnesses to testify against Adams. Among them were Mr. and Mrs. Miller, employees of a gas station in Dallas. They testified that on the night of the incident, while driving home, they saw a police car and a blue car parked by the roadside. The Millers claimed that as they drove by, they glanced inside the blue car and then heard gunshots. In court, Mrs. Miller pointed directly at Adams and confidently identified him as the man she saw in the driver's seat of the blue car that night. Next, Officer Teresa, Officer Wood's colleague, was also called to testify. She stated that she saw the perpetrator sitting in the blue car that night with voluminous hair, feature matching Adams at the time. In court, Adams could not provide an alibi to prove his innocence. He had bought a pack of cigarettes and a newspaper at a convenience store in the motel before 10 p.m. that night. However, since the incident occurred some time ago, the store owner couldn't remember meeting him, and when Adams returned to the apartment, his brother, who lived with him, was asleep, so he couldn't confirm that Adams had come home before 10 p.m. This meant Adams couldn't provide any evidence to prove his innocence. Meanwhile, the witnesses for the prosecution appeared more credible. However, the prosecution's witnesses weren't entirely reliable. First, Mr. and Mrs. Miller. 2 weeks before the incident, Mrs. Miller had been reprimanded by her boss at the gas station for stealing money. The couple often argued and even attacked each other with knives, leading to police intervention. After watching news about Officer Wood's murder at the police station, they suddenly decided to come forward as witnesses. Their former employer described them as professional liars who couldn't be trusted. It was highly likely that the Millers decided to testify in court, hoping to receive a reward from the police. Secondly, Officer Teresa did not follow proper protocol that night. According to standard procedure, when the officer in the left driver's seat exits the car to check the situation, the officer in the right passenger seat must also get out simultaneously. This way, if anything happens, the remaining officer can respond promptly. However, Teresa didn't get out of the car. She stayed inside, drinking her milkshake. When the incident occurred, she hurriedly threw away the milkshake, opened the car door, and fired her gun. These unnecessary steps caused her to miss the best reaction time, allowing the suspect to escape. Notably, in her initial statement, Teresa mentioned only seeing one white man with shoulder-length hair wearing a fur-collared coat in the blue car. However, at the trial, she changed her testimony, stating that the killer had voluminous hair, a description unfavorable to Adams. The Dallas police had lost a colleague and needed to quickly find a suspect to reassure the public. David was only a 16-year-old child, and under Texas law, children under 16 could not be sentenced to death. At that time, the police sent a psychologist named James Grigson to evaluate Adams' mental state. Grigson gave Adams a few sheets of paper with geometric shapes and lines, and asked him to arrange them. Adams, confused, asked what the man wanted him to draw. The psychologist told him to draw whatever he liked, so Adams drew something accordingly. Next, the psychologist asked some strange questions, and the conversation lasted about 15 minutes. In the end, Grigson concluded that he believed Adams would continue to commit crimes if released from prison. After days of heated discussions, the jury delivered a verdict. The Texas court found Randall Adams guilty of murdering Officer Wood and sentenced him to death, with the execution scheduled for 2 years later. At that time, the people of Dallas unanimously condemned Adams as the murderer of the police officer, considering him an unforgivable scoundrel. The court's verdict brought satisfaction to the public, while Adams fell into despair, knowing he was innocent and that no one believed him. 2 years passed quickly and the day of Adams' execution approached. However, there was a turning point. Supreme Court Justice Lewis Franklin Powell Jr. found many suspicious aspects in the case. During jury selection, there had been clear injustices, as some jurors who opposed the death penalty were removed from the list. Thus, 3 days before the execution, the Supreme Court ordered a stay of Adams' execution. Following year, the Supreme Court, with 8 votes in favor and 1 abstention, decided to overturn Adams' death sentence. Upon hearing the news, fearing that a retrial might acquit Adams, the Dallas County prosecutor requested that Adams' sentence be commuted to life imprisonment the day after the Supreme Court's decision. Thus, Adams avoided the death penalty but was left to spend the rest of his life in prison. In the following years, Adams languished in despair in prison, while David continued his criminal activities outside. Eventually, David was arrested for another murder. He had broken into someone else's house and dragged the man's girlfriend outside. The man pursued him with a gun. On the way, David turned around and fired multiple shots at the man. David later turned himself in to the police, maintaining his innocence, claiming that the man had pointed a gun at him and that he acted in self-defense. Police immediately dismissed David's claim, as he had intruded into someone else's home and forcibly taken the man's girlfriend. In 1985, David was sentenced to death for this murder. In 1986, 9 years after the shooting in Dallas, a documentary film titled The Thin Blue Line began production. Director Errol Morris used a docudrama style to revisit the old case, interviewing 12 individuals involved. The filming process resembled a reinvestigation of the case. The more the director delved into the case, the more convinced he became of Adams' innocence. He believed that the real killer that night was David. On December 5, 1986, the director conducted a final interview with David.
Well, what do you think about whether or not he's innocent?
I'm sure he is.
How can you be sure?
Because I'm the one that knows.
From this interview, it became evident that David had nearly confessed to being the one who shot the police officer years ago, while Adams was innocent. If Adams had agreed to let David stay at the motel that night, perhaps things wouldn't have unfolded as they did. In an interview with the Dallas Times-Herald, David officially admitted that Adams was not in the car and that he, David, was the one who fired the shots that killed the police officer that night. Adams had been wrongfully accused. In August 1988, the documentary film was released and made a significant impact on public opinion. The truth about the case finally came to light. The person everyone believed to be the culprit was actually innocent. A year after the documentary's release, Adams was freed after spending 12 years wrongfully imprisoned. However, he did not receive any compensation. In 2004, David was executed for the 1985 murder, but but he was never prosecuted for the Dallas shooting in 1976. In 2010, Adams passed away from brain cancer at the age of 61. This case is a classic example in the history of the U.S. criminal justice system. Had the Supreme Court not intervened to halt the execution, an innocent man would have been put to death. The presumption of innocence is a fundamental right in the U.S. justice system that every defendant is entitled to. However, even this principle cannot prevent individuals from fabricating evidence to falsely accuse others for their gain. How can we ensure that no guilty person goes free while also protecting the innocent from wrongful conviction? This is a question worth deep reflection. Thank you for watching this emotional and tragic story of Randall Dale Adams. His case is a stark reminder of the flaws in the justice system and the unfortunate consequences that can arise. We hope this video has given you a deeper understanding of his story and some valuable lessons. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like to support the channel, comment your thoughts on the case or topics you'd like us to explore further, and subscribe to not miss any future videos. See you in the next video.